There are whispers that should never be heard. Words spoken in hospital corridors that chill the blood and change everything. When Dr. Marcus Webb paused outside room 314 in a small West Virginia hospital, he heard 3 words that would haunt him forever: "She needs to go soon." Inside that room, an elderly woman sat propped against pillows, her eyes vacant yet somehow desperate, her lips forming silent pleas that no one seemed willing to hear. Beside her stood the perfect caregiver, calm, composed, beloved by everyone in town. But something in that moment made Marcus's instincts scream that he was witnessing not devotion, but something far darker. What follows is a story about the lies we tell ourselves to survive, about guilt that poisons everything it touches, and about one woman's 15-year fight to make the truth heard before her own mind was stolen from her. It's a story where the line between victim and villain blurs in ways that will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew about justice, forgiveness, and the terrible weight of secrets kept too long. Some truths destroy everyone they touch. But some truths are worth dying for. If you want to discover stories that will make you feel deeply, think differently, and see the world through new eyes, follow this channel. Leave a like if this story touched your heart, and comment below telling us where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more of these powerful narratives to life. The words came like a blade through silence. "She needs to go soon." Dr. Marcus Webb froze mid-step in the narrow hallway of Morgantown General, a small community hospital tucked into the coal-dusted hills of West Virginia. The voice was barely a whisper, slipping through the crack of room 314's half-open door, but it carried the kind of cold certainty that makes skin crawl. He'd been a physician for 23 years, had heard families discuss end-of-life care in every possible tone, grief-stricken, resigned, desperate, but this was different. This was calculation. He should have kept walking. He had 4 more patients to see before his shift ended, paperwork stacked like accusations on his desk, and a daughter waiting for him to pick her up from soccer practice. But something in that whisper, something sharp and wrong, rooted him to the scuffed linoleum floor. Marcus edged closer to the door, his white coat brushing against the doorframe. Through the gap, he could see the hospital bed, the tangle of 4 lines, the pale yellow curtains that tried and failed to make the room feel less like a holding cell. And there, propped against thin pillows that did nothing to support her frail frame, was Helen Moore. She looked like she was disappearing. That was the first thought that struck him. Not dying, disappearing. Her skin had that translucent quality of old paper left too long in sunlight, her cheekbones jutting through flesh that seemed to be retreating from her skull. But it was her eyes that twisted something in Marcus's chest. They were open, staring at the ceiling, but there was a horrible emptiness in them, like someone had reached inside and scooped out whatever spark had once lived there. Her lips moved soundlessly, forming words that never quite made it to air, and her right hand trembled against the thin hospital blanket, fingers twitching as if trying to grab hold of something just out of reach. Standing beside the bed, holding a small plastic cup of water and a handful of pills, was Lydia Moore. Helen's daughter-in-law. Marcus had met her twice before, once during admission, once during rounds, and both times she'd impressed him with her composure. She was the kind of woman church communities loved, mid-40s, dressed modestly in a cardigan despite the September heat, her dark hair pulled into a neat bun that suggested control and propriety. She spoke in soft, measured tones, answered medical questions with precision, and radiated the exhausted devotion of a caregiver stretched too thin. But now, watching her through that sliver of open door, Marcus saw something else entirely. Lydia's face was blank. Not sad. Not worried. Blank. She held the cup with steady hands, tilting it toward Helen's lips with the mechanical patience of someone performing a rehearsed task. There was no tenderness in the gesture, no whispered encouragement. Just efficiency. "Come on, Helen," Lydia said quietly, her voice pleasant and hollow. "Just a few more. These will help you sleep." Helen's head turned slightly, her vacant eyes finding Lydia's face, and for a moment, just a flash, something flickered there. Recognition. Fear. Her mouth opened wider, a thin sound escaping like air from a punctured tire. And no. I don't. Shoo. Lydia's hand moved to Helen's shoulder, pressing down just firmly enough to keep her still. You're confused again. The doctor said you need to take these. Remember? Marcus felt his jaw tighten. He'd prescribed medication for Helen Moore, a standard regimen for her conditions, which included high blood pressure, anxiety, and early-stage dementia, but watching this scene unfold made his instincts scream. There was something performative about Lydia's care, something too smooth, like watching an actress who'd memorized her lines but forgotten to feel them. Helen's trembling hand reached up, fingers wrapping weakly around Lydia's wrist. Her voice came out cracked and desperate. Was it you? That night, the rain. I saw. Lydia's expression didn't change, but her grip on the cup tightened almost imperceptibly. You're having another episode, Helen. You don't know what you're saying. I know. I know what I. Helen's words dissolved into a whimper, her eyes flooding with tears that spilled down her temples and soaked into the pillow. Her whole body seemed to curl inward, as if trying to protect something fragile inside her that was already breaking. Marcus pushed the door open. Both women's heads snapped toward him. Lydia's face rearranged itself instantly, surprise, then relief, then that practiced smile of a grateful family member seeing the doctor arrive. Dr. Webb, she said warmly, setting the cup down on the bedside table. I'm so glad you're here. Helen's been having a rough afternoon. Marcus stepped into the room, his gaze moving from Lydia to Helen and back again. The old woman had gone still, her eyes fixed on him with an intensity that felt like drowning. Her lips were still moving, still forming those silent, desperate words. How long has she been like this? Marcus asked, moving to the bedside and reaching for Helen's wrist to check her pulse. It was rapid, fluttering like a trapped bird. Since this morning, Lydia replied, folding her hands in front of her. She keeps saying strange things. Talking about people who aren't here, events that never happened. The dementia is progressing faster than we thought. Marcus glanced at Helen's chart, clipped to the end of the bed. Her vitals were erratic, blood pressure elevated, heart rate inconsistent, but nothing that screamed immediate crisis. Yet something felt catastrophically wrong. Helen, he said gently, leaning closer. Can you hear me? Do you know where you are? Her fingers suddenly clamped around his hand with surprising strength, nails digging into his skin. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment the fog lifted just enough for him to see the person still trapped inside. It was her, Helen whispered, her voice barely audible. That night, she. Helen, please, Lydia interrupted, stepping closer. You're going to upset yourself. But Helen wasn't listening to Lydia. Her entire focus was on Marcus, her grip tightening until it hurt. She gave me something wrong. The words came in gasps, each one a struggle. I tried to tell, but no one. Then, as quickly as it had come, the lucidity vanished. Helen's hand went slack, her eyes glazing over again, and she slumped back against the pillows with a soft, broken sound that might have been a sob or might have been surrender. Marcus straightened slowly, his mind racing. He looked at the bedside table, at the pills Lydia had been trying to give her, then at the prescription bottles lined up like soldiers near the water pitcher. May I see her medications? He asked, keeping his tone professional. Of course. Lydia handed them over without hesitation, her expression open and cooperative. Marcus examined each bottle carefully. Everything matched what he'd prescribed, at least on the labels. But something nagged at him, some instinct honed by years of catching the details others missed. He unscrewed one of the caps, shook a few pills into his palm, and studied them under the fluorescent light. The shape was right. The color was right. But the dosage markings looked off. Just slightly. Like someone had taken the time to find pills that looked similar but weren't quite identical. These are the prescriptions I filled last week, Lydia said, watching him. From Martin's pharmacy on Route 7. Is something wrong? Marcus met her eyes. They were calm, almost amused, as if she knew exactly what he was thinking and found it mildly entertaining. I'd like to run some tests, he said carefully. Just to make sure Helen's medication levels are where they should be. Lydia's smile didn't waver. Whatever you think is best, doctor. We just want her to be comfortable. The word comfortable hung in the air like a threat. Marcus stayed with Helen for another 10 minutes, checking her vitals again, asking questions Lydia answered with perfect, unshakable composure. The whole time, he felt like he was watching a performance, two people playing roles in a script only one of them had read. When he finally left the room, he paused in the doorway and looked back. Lydia was sitting in the chair beside Helen's bed, one hand resting gently on the old woman's arm. From this angle, to anyone passing by, it would look like devotion. Like love. But Helen's eyes were open again, staring at the ceiling, and tears were streaming silently down her face. Marcus pulled out his phone as he walked toward the nurse's station, his hands shaking slightly as he typed a message to the hospital pharmacist, "Need medication analysis on patient Helen Moore, room 314. Priority." He didn't know what he'd just witnessed. Didn't know if his instincts were right or if exhaustion was making him paranoid. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. Helen Moore wasn't just sick. She was being silenced. And somewhere in the gap between what Lydia said and what Helen couldn't say, there was a truth so terrible that someone was willing to destroy an old woman's mind to keep it buried. The first time Marcus heard Lydia Moore praised in public, he was standing in line at Sullivan's Diner on Main Street, waiting for coffee he desperately needed after a 12-hour shift. It was a Thursday morning, the kind where autumn fog still clung to the mountains and the smell of bacon grease promised comfort to anyone willing to pay $4 for it. "That Lydia Moore is a saint, I tell you," the woman ahead of him was saying to the cashier, her voice carrying that particular tone of small-town certainty that allowed no disagreement. She was elderly herself, probably in her 70s, wearing a floral church dress despite it being barely 8 in the morning. Taking care of poor Helen all by herself, day and night. "I don't know how she does it." The cashier, a tired-looking woman named Beth who'd worked at Sullivan's longer than Marcus had been alive, nodded along while pouring coffee. "Don't see the son helping much, do you? Off in Charleston, too busy with his own life." "Exactly," the church woman continued, warming to her subject. "But Lydia never complains. Never asks for help. Just keeps on being there for that woman, even when Helen doesn't recognize her half the time. That's true Christian devotion right there." Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach. He'd spent the last 3 days trying to get the hospital pharmacy to prioritize Helen's medication analysis, hitting wall after wall of bureaucracy and weekend delays. Meanwhile, Helen remained in room 314, her confusion deepening, her moments of clarity becoming shorter and more desperate each time he checked on her. And here was Lydia's reputation, polished and perfect, armor that would deflect any accusation he might make. He paid for his coffee without commenting, but the conversation stayed with him all morning, needling at him while he saw other patients, while he filled out paperwork, while he tried to focus on diagnoses that didn't involve conspiracy theories about medication tampering. By lunchtime, he'd made a decision he knew was probably crossing a line. He drove to the address listed in Helen's admission file, a modest 2-story house on Elm Street, white paint peeling slightly at the corners, a neat garden out front with late-season roses still blooming despite the cooling weather. The whole scene looked like something from a postcard about small-town American values. A tire swing hung from an old oak tree in the yard. An American flag fluttered on the porch. Everything about it whispered normalcy. Marcus sat in his car for a full 5 minutes, debating whether what he was about to do constituted a violation of medical ethics or just good instinct. Finally, he got out and walked to the front door, rehearsing what he'd say if Lydia answered. She didn't. Instead, a younger woman opened the door, mid-20s, wearing scrubs, looking harried and suspicious in equal measure. "Can I help you?" she asked, one hand still on the doorknob as if ready to close it quickly. Marcus showed his hospital ID. Dr. Webb, from Morgantown General. I'm one of Mrs. Moore's attending physicians. I wanted to check on some aspects of her home care situation. The woman's expression shifted from suspicious to relieved, and she opened the door wider. Oh, thank God. I'm Rachel, I work at the hospital too, actually. Nurse on the cardiac floor. I'm Lydia's neighbor. She glanced over her shoulder, then lowered her voice. Is this about Helen? Something in her tone made Marcus's pulse quicken. Why do you ask? Rachel hesitated, clearly wrestling with whether to say what she was thinking. Then she stepped out onto the porch, pulling the door mostly closed behind her. Look, I don't want to start rumors or anything, she began, wrapping her arms around herself despite wearing a thick cardigan. And Lydia's always been nice to me. But, there's something I noticed, and I can't stop thinking about it. What did you notice? It's the medications, Rachel said quietly. I've seen Lydia at the pharmacy where I pick up my own prescriptions. Martin's, you know, on Route 7. She's there at least twice a week, sometimes more. And I've seen her talking to the pharmacist for a long time, asking very specific questions about drug interactions, side effects, things like that. Marcus kept his expression neutral. That's not unusual for someone caring for an elderly patient. I know, but... Rachel bit her lip, then continued. About 3 weeks ago, I saw her there again, and I overheard part of her conversation. She was asking about medications that could cause confusion or memory problems. The pharmacist was explaining how certain dosages could affect cognitive function. And the way she was listening, it wasn't worried. It was, interested. Like she was taking notes for something. The cold feeling in Marcus's stomach intensified. Did you hear anything specific? Just fragments. Something about how long it would take for symptoms to appear. Whether they'd be permanent or reversible. The pharmacist kept saying it depended on the duration and dosage, and Lydia kept asking what-if questions. Rachel's voice dropped to almost a whisper. Then she saw me and the conversation stopped immediately. She smiled, asked about my shift schedule, completely changed subjects like we'd been talking about the weather. Marcus processed this information carefully. It wasn't proof of anything concrete, a caregiver researching medications could be showing diligence rather than malice. But combined with what he'd witnessed in the hospital, with Helen's desperate attempts to communicate, with those slightly wrong pills. Has Helen's condition changed recently? He asked. In the last few weeks. Rachel nodded slowly. That's the thing that really bothers me. I used to see Helen in her garden sometimes, before she went to the hospital. She'd forget things, sure, ask me the same question twice, lose track of conversations, but she was still herself. Still had that spark, you know. Could tell you stories about growing up in these mountains that'd make you laugh and cry at the same time. And now? Now she's like a ghost. Rachel's eyes filled with tears. I visited her at the hospital last week, Lydia was there, of course, barely left the room, and Helen just stared. Didn't recognize me. Couldn't form complete sentences. It happened so fast, Dr. Webb. Too fast for normal dementia progression. They stood in silence for a moment, the autumn wind rustling through the oak tree, making the tire sway gently like a memory of children who'd long since grown up and moved away. Where's Helen's son? Marcus asked. David, right? Rachel's expression hardened slightly. Charleston. He calls every few days, but he hasn't visited in over a month. Says he's too busy with work. Lydia gives him updates, tells him everything's under control, that Helen's getting the best care possible. She paused. I don't think he wants to see how bad it's gotten. Easier to believe Lydia's version of events than to come face the reality. Marcus thanked her and returned to his car, his mind churning. He sat behind the wheel, staring at Helen's house, thinking about how easy it would be to poison someone slowly with the very things meant to heal them. How a caregiver with access, with trust, with the perfect reputation could manipulate medications right under everyone's noses. But thinking it and proving it were catastrophically different things. His phone buzzed. A text from the hospital pharmacy, preliminary analysis complete on more medications. Results show inconsistencies with prescribed dosages. Some pills appear to be different formulations than ordered. Recommend immediate review. Marcus's hands tightened on the steering wheel. He had his proof. The question now was what to do with it, and whether Helen would survive long enough for the truth to matter. Because if Lydia realized she was being investigated, if she felt cornered, there was no telling what desperate measures she might take to silence the one person who could destroy her carefully constructed image. Inside that perfect house with its perfect garden and perfect flag, Marcus knew, something rotten was growing. Something that wore the face of devotion while slowly erasing an old woman's mind, one tampered pill at a time. And the most terrifying part was how easily everyone believed the lie. Marcus found the newspaper article by accident. He'd gone to the Morgantown Public Library after his shift, telling himself he was just doing due diligence, following up on a medical hunch that had nothing to do with obsession. The library was one of those Carnegie buildings from the early 1900s, all dark wood and high ceilings, smelling of old paper and the peculiar mustiness that comes from housing a century's worth of stories nobody reads anymore. The librarian, a woman named Dolores who remembered when card catalogs were still the only option, helped him navigate the microfiche machine with the patience of someone who taught this same lesson 1,000 times. "What dates are you looking for?" she asked, adjusting her bifocals. Marcus hesitated. He didn't know, exactly. He was searching for something that might not exist, guided only by the fragment of words Helen had gasped in her moments of clarity. That night. The rain. "Let's start with 15 years ago," he said. "Local news, incident reports." Dolores nodded and began pulling boxes of film from the archive room, each one labeled with years and months in her precise handwriting. "Researching family history?" she asked conversationally. "Something like that." He spent 2 hours scrolling through grainy images of the Morgantown Gazette, his eyes starting to ache from the green-tinted screen. High school football scores. Church bake sales. Obituaries. Council meetings about zoning laws. The mundane rhythm of small-town life, preserved on film that crackled and jumped as he advanced it frame by frame. Then, dated October 23, 2009, he found it. The headline was small, buried on page 4, "Local woman dies in home accident." Marcus's hands stilled on the controls. He read slowly, his heart rate climbing with each sentence. Jessica Harrington, 34, was found deceased in her home on Maple Ridge Road on Tuesday evening. Authorities report the death appears to be accidental, resulting from a fall down the basement stairs during a power outage caused by severe thunderstorms. Harrington was discovered by her sister-in-law, Lydia Harrington, who had come to check on her during the storm. The victim's husband, Thomas Harrington, was reportedly out of town on business at the time. Sheriff's Department spokesman Michael Cruz stated that while the investigation is ongoing, there are no signs of foul play. Harrington is survived by her husband and parents, Robert and Ellen Carter of Charleston. Services will be held Saturday at First Methodist Church. Marcus read it 3 times, each word settling into his consciousness like stones dropping into still water. Lydia Harrington. Before she became Lydia Moore. He searched for Thomas Harrington in subsequent editions and found a brief follow-up 2 weeks later. Thomas had left West Virginia shortly after his wife's funeral, unable to bear living in the house where she'd died. The property had been sold. No mention of where he'd gone or what happened to him after that. But there was something else, a letter to the editor published 3 weeks after Jessica's death. Marcus almost missed it, would have scrolled right past if not for the name in the signature. To the editor, "I am writing regarding the recent death of my daughter, Jessica Harrington. While I understand the Sheriff's Department has concluded their investigation, I cannot accept that my daughter's death was simply an accident. Jessica was terrified of storms her entire life and would never have gone into the basement alone during a power outage. She had a phobia of dark, enclosed spaces that anyone who knew her could attest to. Furthermore, Jessica had confided in me weeks before her death that she felt unsafe in her marriage, that she had discovered something about her husband's family that frightened her. She would not elaborate, saying only that she was gathering evidence and would tell me everything when it was safe to do so. I am calling for the investigation to be reopened and for authorities to examine all aspects of Jessica's life and relationships in the weeks preceding her death. A mother knows when something is wrong, and I know in my heart that my daughter did not simply fall down those stairs. Ellen Carter, Charleston, West Virginia. Marcus sat back, his mind racing. He advanced through more editions, looking for any response, any follow-up, any indication that Ellen Carter's plea had been heard. Nothing. The story had died as quietly as Jessica Harrington herself. He printed the articles, his hands shaking slightly as the ancient printer wheezed and groaned, producing copies that smelled of toner and heat. Dolores glanced over from her desk but said nothing, her expression carefully neutral in the way of librarians who'd learned that curiosity about patron research led nowhere good. Marcus drove straight to the sheriff's department, a squat brick building on the edge of town that always smelled like burned coffee and industrial cleaner. The deputy at the front desk, a young man named Collins who looked barely old enough to shave, listened to his request with growing skepticism. "You want to see a case file from 2009? Collins repeated. "About an accidental death? I'm a physician at Morgantown General. I'm treating a patient whose medical situation may be connected to this incident." It wasn't exactly a lie, but it wasn't exactly the truth either, and Marcus could feel the ethical ground shifting beneath him. Collins disappeared into a back room and returned 20 minutes later with a thin manila folder. "You can look at it here," he said, gesturing to a scarred wooden table in the corner. "Can't take anything with you, though. Policy." The file was depressingly sparse. Scene photos showed a modest basement with concrete stairs, a body at the bottom covered by a sheet in the images Marcus forced himself to look at. The medical examiner's report listed cause of death as blunt force trauma consistent with a fall. Tox screen negative for intoxicants. No defensive wounds. No signs of struggle. But there were witness statements. Lydia's was detailed and calm, given the night of Jessica's death. She'd arrived at the house around 8:30, she stated, worried because Jessica hadn't answered her phone during the storm. She'd found the door unlocked, unusual, but Jessica was forgetful sometimes, and had called out, getting no response. She'd searched the house and finally found Jessica at the bottom of the basement stairs. She'd immediately called 911 and attempted CPR until paramedics arrived, though she knew from the position of the body that Jessica was already gone. The investigating officer's notes praised Lydia's composure and helpfulness during a traumatic situation. Marcus flipped to the next statement and felt his blood run cold. It was from Helen Moore, dated October 24, 2009, the day after Jessica's death. The handwriting was shakier than the official report, as if someone had taken Helen's statement while she was deeply upset, but the words were clear enough. "I was Thomas's mother, visiting from Charleston for the week. I was staying in their guest room. The night Jessica died, I heard arguing earlier in the evening, around 7 o'clock. I couldn't make out the words, but the voices were raised, Jessica and Lydia. I thought about going downstairs but decided it was family business, not my place to interfere. Later, maybe 8 or 8:15, I heard Lydia's car pull up outside. I heard the front door open and close. Then silence for several minutes. Then I heard Lydia screaming for help. When I came downstairs, Lydia was on the phone with 911, and Jessica was. Jessica was at the bottom of the basement stairs. I asked Lydia what happened, and she said she'd just arrived, found Jessica like this. But I know I heard her car earlier. I know I heard them arguing. I tried to tell the officer this was wrong, that something didn't make sense, but he said I was confused, that grief and shock can make people remember things incorrectly. He said the timeline was clear, Lydia arrived at 8:30, found Jessica, called for help. But I know what I heard. I know. The statement ended there, mid-thought, as if Helen had been too upset to continue or as if someone had decided she'd said enough. Marcus checked the investigating officer's notes on Helen's statement. Witness appears unreliable due to emotional distress and potential hearing difficulties. Timeline inconsistencies attributed to confusion about sequence of events. Primary witness, L. Harrington, account deemed more credible. Helen had tried to tell them. 15 years ago, she tried to tell them that something was wrong, that Lydia's story didn't match what she'd heard, and she'd been dismissed as confused, unreliable, too grief-stricken to remember correctly. And now, 15 years later, Helen was in a hospital bed, her mind being systematically destroyed by the very person she tried to warn everyone about. Marcus closed the file with hands that trembled from rage more than fear. He understood now. This wasn't just about keeping an old woman quiet, this was about burying a truth that Lydia thought she'd successfully hidden years ago. Helen was the only person left who knew what really happened that rainy night in October 2009. The only witness who'd heard the arguing, who'd noticed the timeline didn't match, who'd refused to accept the convenient narrative of a tragic accident. And Lydia had married Helen's son 2 years after Jessica's death. The pieces fell into place with horrible clarity, Lydia getting close to the family, becoming indispensable, marrying David and ensuring her place in Helen's life. And Helen, watching helplessly as her daughter-in-law, the woman she suspected of something unspeakable, became family, became trusted, became untouchable. No wonder Helen had tried to speak when she saw him. No wonder her lucid moments were focused on that one desperate message, it was her. That night, Marcus thanked Deputy Collins and walked out into the parking lot, where the October sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that looked too beautiful for the ugliness he'd just uncovered. His phone rang. The hospital. Dr. Webb. This is Sandra from the nursing station. Mrs. Moore in 314 is asking for you. She seems very agitated. Marcus's pulse jumped. I'll be right there. He drove faster than he should have, his mind full of rainy nights and basement stairs and the sound of arguing that only one person had been brave enough to report. When he reached room 314, he found Helen alone, sitting up in bed with a piece of paper clutched in her shaking hands. She looked at him with eyes that were clear, heartbreakingly, desperately clear. I tried to warn them, she whispered. I tried. Marcus crossed the room in 3 strides, his heart hammering against his ribs. Helen's clarity was like watching ice crack under pressure, beautiful and terrifying because you knew it wouldn't last, that any second the surface would give way and she'd plunge back into the fog that Lydia had wrapped around her mind. Helen, he said softly, pulling a chair close to her bed. I'm here. I'm listening. Her fingers clutched the piece of paper so tightly it was crumpling at the edges. Marcus could see writing on it, shaky, desperate handwriting that lurched across the page like someone running from something they couldn't escape. I wrote it down, Helen whispered, her voice raw from disuse and emotion. Before I forget again. Before she makes me forget. I wrote down what I remember. Tears streamed down her face, catching in the deep lines around her mouth. But it comes in pieces now, Doctor. Like a mirror that's been shattered. I can see fragments, but I can't. I can't make them fit together anymore. Marcus reached for her hand, covering those trembling fingers with his own. Tell me what you remember. Any piece. Start anywhere. Helen's eyes darted to the door, a quick, frightened glance that spoke of surveillance, of not knowing when Lydia might appear. Then she looked back at Marcus, and for a moment he saw not the confused elderly patient everyone dismissed, but the mother who tried to save a daughter-in-law 15 years ago and failed. Jessica, Helen began, the name coming out like a prayer and an apology wrapped together. She called me 3 weeks before she died. It was late, past midnight, and she was crying so hard I could barely understand her. She said she'd found something in Lydia and Thomas's house. Papers. Documents. She wouldn't tell me what they were over the phone, said she needed to show me in person, that it was too dangerous to explain any other way. Helen paused, her breath coming in short gasps as she fought to hold on to the memory. Marcus waited, knowing that pushing would only shatter this fragile moment. She said Lydia wasn't who everyone thought she was, Helen continued, her voice dropping to barely a whisper. That there were things in her past, things she'd done, that Jessica had uncovered. Jessica was terrified, but she was also determined. She said she was going to confront Lydia, make her tell Thomas the truth. I begged her not to. I told her to go to the police first, to not face Lydia alone. But Jessica. Helen's voice broke. Jessica said family deserved the chance to explain themselves first. She said that's what good people did. The cruelty of that sentiment hung in the air between them, Jessica's decency had killed her. The night of the storm, Helen said, her eyes unfocusing slightly as she traveled back through 15 years of guilt and helplessness. I was staying with them because Thomas was away on business. Jessica had been nervous all day, kept checking the windows like she was waiting for something. Or someone. Around 7 o'clock, I heard a car pull up. I looked out the guest room window and saw Lydia getting out. Marcus felt every muscle in his body tense. This matched what Helen had told the police, but now there was more detail, more context. I heard them talking downstairs. At first it was normal voices, then it got louder. Jessica was saying something about lies, about how she couldn't let it continue. Lydia's voice was calm, so calm it frightened me more than yelling would have. She kept saying, "You don't understand, you don't know what you're talking about." Helen's hands were shaking violently now. Then Jessica said something I'll never forget. She said, "I know about Atlanta. I know what you did there." Atlanta? Marcus leaned forward. What happened in Atlanta? I don't know, Helen said, frustration and anguish mixing in her voice. That's one of the pieces I can't find anymore. I used to know. I used to have all the pieces. But the medicines. She looked at him with such desperate clarity it made his chest ache. She's been changing my medicines, hasn't she? Making me forget. Making everyone think I'm just a confused old woman so nobody will believe me when I try to tell them. Marcus wanted to lie, to offer comfort, but Helen deserved the truth. Yes, he said quietly. I think she has been. But I found evidence. The pharmacy confirmed the medications were tampered with. Helen, I believe you. Everything you're telling me, I believe you. The relief that washed over her face was heartbreaking. You believe me, she repeated, as if the words were a lifeline thrown to someone drowning. No one believed me before. The police said I was confused. David said grief was making me imagine things. Even Thomas, he was so destroyed by Jessica's death that when I tried to tell him something was wrong, he couldn't hear it. He needed it to be an accident. Needed it to be anything except the truth. What happened after Jessica mentioned Atlanta? Marcus asked gently, trying to guide her back to the narrative before the clarity faded. Helen closed her eyes, and Marcus could see her fighting to hold on to memories that were slipping through her fingers like water. The arguing got worse. I heard furniture moving, like they were standing up quickly. Then there was silence, horrible silence, for maybe 5 minutes. Then I heard the basement door open. I thought maybe Jessica had gone down there to get away from the argument, to calm down. But the lights were out, Marcus said, remembering the police report. The storm had knocked out power. That's what never made sense, Helen said, her eyes opening wide. Jessica was terrified of the dark. Absolutely terrified. She'd told me once about getting locked in a closet as a child, how she still had nightmares about it. She kept flashlights in every room of that house. She would never have gone into that dark basement alone during a power outage. Never. The implications hung between them like storm clouds. I heard Lydia's voice from somewhere downstairs, calm, controlled, calling out Jessica's name like she was looking for her. Then there was a sound. Helen's breath caught. A sound I can't describe properly. A thump, and then, silence. Then Lydia started screaming. By the time I made it downstairs, Lydia was at the bottom of the basement stairs, crouched next to Jessica, her phone in her hand. She looked up at me and said, "I just got here. I found her like this." "Oh God, I just found her." "But you'd heard her car arrive an hour earlier," Marcus said. "Exactly." Helen's grip on his hand tightened. "I told the police. I told them Lydia had been there earlier, that they'd been arguing. But Lydia had an explanation for everything. She said she'd stopped by around 7 to drop off some mail she'd accidentally received, stayed for just a minute, then left. Said she came back later because she was worried about Jessica being alone during the storm. The police believed her. Why wouldn't they? She was the grieving sister-in-law, I was the confused mother-in-law who'd lost her hearing aids and might have mixed up sounds and times. Marcus thought about the police report, about how efficiently Helen's testimony had been dismissed. "Did you ever find out what Jessica discovered in Atlanta?" Helen's expression crumpled. "That's what I can't remember anymore. I used to know. I swear I used to know. Jessica had told me something specific, something concrete, but now when I reach for that memory it's just fog. Lydia's been stealing my memories along with my credibility, making sure that even if someone finally listened to me, I wouldn't be able to tell them the whole truth." The paper in Helen's hand rustled as her shaking intensified. She thrust it toward Marcus suddenly, desperately. "Take this. Hide it. She'll find it if you leave it here. She finds everything." Marcus unfolded the paper carefully. The handwriting was barely legible, written in what looked like several different attempts, some lines crossed out and rewritten, others trailing off mid-sentence. But he could make out fragments. "Jessica knew about Atlanta. Lydia was there earlier. I heard the car. Jessica wouldn't go into dark basement. I tried to warn them. She's making me forget the medicines are wrong. Someone please believe me." At the bottom, written larger and more desperately than the rest, "I'm not crazy. I'm not confused. Something terrible happened and she's getting away with it." Marcus folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket just as footsteps echoed in the hallway outside. Helen's clarity evaporated like morning dew under sunlight. Her eyes went vague, her body slumped, and by the time the door opened, she was staring at the ceiling again, lips moving soundlessly. Lydia stood in the doorway, her arms full of flowers and magazines, her expression the perfect mixture of concern and warmth. "Dr. Webb," she said pleasantly. "I didn't know you were here. Is everything all right with Helen?" Marcus stood, forcing his voice to remain professional. "Just checking her vitals. Everything seems stable." Lydia's gaze moved to Helen, then back to Marcus. For just a fraction of a second, something flickered in her eyes, calculation, assessment, measuring what he might know and what he might do with it. "She seems more settled today," Lydia said, moving to Helen's bedside and arranging the flowers in a vase with practiced care. "The new medication adjustment must be helping." Marcus felt sick. "What new adjustment?" "Oh, the night nurse mentioned Helen was agitated yesterday, so I asked if we could increase her anxiety medication slightly. Just temporary, of course, until she stabilizes." Lydia smiled at him, all innocence and dedication. "I hope that's all right. I know you're her primary physician, but I thought it would help her rest better." She'd done it again, changed the medications, increased the dosage that kept Helen confused, all under the guise of concerned caregiving. And she'd done it so smoothly, so reasonably, that questioning it would make Marcus look paranoid. "I'd prefer to be consulted about any medication changes," Marcus said carefully. "Of course," Lydia replied, her smile never wavering. "I'll make sure to go through you directly from now on." Marcus left the room feeling like he'd just lost a battle he hadn't known he was fighting. In his pocket, Helen's note felt like both evidence and accusation, proof that she tried to warn everyone, and proof that no one had listened until it was almost too late. Marcus found Thomas Harrington living in a rental apartment in Savannah, Georgia, working as a manager at a boat repair shop near the marina. It had taken 3 days of phone calls, database searches, and favors called in from colleagues who knew people who knew people. The man who answered the door looked nothing like the husband from the newspaper photos Marcus had found. That man had been broad-shouldered and confident, standing next to Jessica with the easy smile of someone who believed the world made sense. This Thomas was hollow-eyed and thin, wearing a stained work shirt that smelled of engine oil and salt water. He stared at Marcus through the screen door with the wary expression of someone who'd learned that unexpected visitors brought only bad news. "Thomas Harrington?" Marcus asked. "Depends on who's asking." His voice was rougher than Marcus expected, abraded by years of cigarettes and grief. "My name is Dr. Marcus Webb. I'm calling from Morgantown General Hospital in West Virginia. I need to talk to you about your mother, Helen Moore, and about your first wife, Jessica." Thomas's face went rigid. For a moment Marcus thought he'd slammed the door, but instead he pushed the screen open and stepped aside. "You better come in." The apartment was sparse: a couch, a television, empty beer bottles lined up on the kitchen counter like soldiers awaiting orders. Photos covered one wall, though, and Marcus recognized Jessica in most of them. Jessica at the beach. Jessica laughing at a birthday party. Jessica in a wedding dress, young and radiant and alive. "How's Mom?" Thomas asked, not looking at Marcus as he cleared newspapers off the couch. "She's in the hospital. She's been experiencing severe cognitive decline over the past few months." Thomas nodded as if he'd expected this. "Lydia keeps me updated. Says the dementia is progressing faster than the doctors anticipated." He finally met Marcus's eyes. "But you didn't drive all the way to Georgia to tell me something my wife already did. What's this really about?" Marcus pulled out the folder he'd brought: copies of the police report, Helen's witness statement, the newspaper articles, the pharmacy analysis of the tampered medications. He laid them on the coffee table between them like cards in a game neither of them wanted to play. "I think your mother is being poisoned," Marcus said. "I think Lydia has been systematically altering her medications to cause confusion and memory loss. And I think she's doing it because Helen knows the truth about what happened to Jessica." Thomas stared at the documents for a long time without touching them. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "I knew." Marcus felt the air leave his lungs. "What?" "Not about Mom, I didn't know about that." Thomas's hands were shaking as he reached for one of the beer bottles, then thought better of it and pulled back. "But I knew something was wrong the night Jessica died. I knew my mother wasn't confused about the timeline. I knew Jessica would never go into that basement alone in the dark. I knew all of it." His voice cracked. "And I did nothing." The confession hung in the small apartment like smoke from a fire that had burned out long ago but left everything damaged. "Tell me what you knew," Marcus said quietly. Thomas walked to the wall of photos, stopping in front of one that showed him, Jessica, and Lydia at what looked like a family barbecue. They were all smiling. Jessica found documents in Lydia's apartment about 2 months before she died. She'd gone over there to water plants while Lydia was out of town. They were close then, or I thought they were. Jessica found a box in the back of Lydia's closet. Inside were newspaper clippings, police reports, and legal documents, all related to a woman named Sarah Chen who died in Atlanta in 2007. Marcus pulled out his phone and started taking notes. How did Sarah Chen die? Carbon monoxide poisoning in her apartment. It was ruled accidental, faulty heater, tragic but not suspicious. Except. Thomas turned to face Marcus, and there were tears streaming down his face now. Sarah Chen was Lydia's roommate. And she'd just changed her will 2 weeks before her death, leaving everything to Lydia. It was only about $40,000, but for someone in their mid-20s struggling to pay rent, it was life-changing money. And Jessica thought Lydia was responsible for Sarah's death. Jessica knew she was responsible, Thomas said, his voice hardening. Because among the documents was a receipt for a space heater purchase that Lydia had made, the exact model that investigators determined had the faulty connection that caused the carbon monoxide leak. And there were notes in Lydia's handwriting about Sarah's schedule, about when she'd be alone in the apartment, about how long it would take for symptoms to appear. Jessica was meticulous, she made copies of everything before confronting Lydia. Marcus felt his pulse accelerating. Where are those copies now? Thomas's expression was answer enough. Gone. After Jessica died, I looked everywhere for them. Jessica had told me she'd hidden them somewhere safe, but she never said where. I tore apart our house, searched her car, checked her office. Nothing. Either Lydia found them first, or... He gestured helplessly. Or they never existed anywhere except at the bottom of those basement stairs with Jessica. Your mother told the police she heard arguing that night. She said Lydia arrived earlier than she claimed. Mom tried so hard to make me listen, Thomas said, his voice breaking completely now. She sat me down a week after the funeral and told me everything she'd heard, everything that didn't add up. She begged me to demand the police reopen the investigation. And I. He covered his face with his hands. I told her she was imagining things. That grief was making her see conspiracies where there was only tragedy. I chose to believe Lydia over my own mother because believing Lydia was easier. Because if Mom was right, it meant I'd brought a killer into our family. It meant I'd been sleeping next to someone capable of that level of calculation while my wife died alone in the dark. So you left, Marcus said, understanding flooding through him. I ran, Thomas corrected. I sold the house, moved as far from West Virginia as I could get, and I've been running ever since. When Lydia started dating David 2 years later, I should have warned him. Should have told him what Jessica suspected, what Mom had witnessed. But I couldn't face it. Couldn't face any of it. So I let Lydia marry my brother, let her move into my mother's life, and I told myself it would be fine. That maybe Jessica had been wrong. That maybe Mom had been confused. But you never believed that, Marcus said. No. Thomas looked at him with eyes full of 15 years of guilt and cowardice. I never believed it. I just chose survival over truth. And now my mother is paying the price for my weakness. Marcus stood and gathered the documents. I need you to come back to West Virginia with me. I need you to tell the police everything you just told me. It's not too late to protect Helen. Thomas was already shaking his head before Marcus finished speaking. You don't understand. Lydia is untouchable. She's been planning this for decades, every move calculated, every contingency prepared for. She married into my family to keep Helen close, to monitor what she remembered, to control the narrative. The medications, the reputation she built in the community, the way she isolated Mom from anyone who might believe her, it's all been one long, patient game of making sure the only witness to what happened to Jessica could never be believed. Then we make her believe she's won, Marcus said, an idea forming. Helen told me she can't remember what Jessica discovered about Atlanta anymore, the medications have stolen those specific memories. Lydia doesn't know that I found you, doesn't know that you still remember everything Jessica told you. If we can get Helen to a safe place, away from Lydia's access, stop the medication tampering, maybe her memories will return. And if they don't? Then we work with what we have, your testimony about what Jessica told you, the physical evidence of medication tampering, the pattern of behavior. It's not perfect, but it's more than Helen has had for 15 years. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring at the photos of Jessica. Finally, he nodded. Okay. But I need to tell you something else first. Something that might change your mind about all of this. Marcus waited. When Lydia called me last week to update me on Mom's condition, she said something strange. She said, Helen seems to be letting go of the past finally. Finding peace with things she can't change. At the time I thought it was just Lydia's way of saying Mom's dementia was worsening. But now. Thomas met Marcus's eyes. I think Lydia was telling me she'd won. That she'd finally erased the last person who could expose her. And the worst part is, a piece of me felt relieved. Because if Mom can't remember anymore, then maybe I can finally stop running from my own guilt. The honesty of that confession, the raw, ugly truth of it, sat between them like a third person in the room. Your mother is still fighting, Marcus said quietly. Even with her memories fragmenting, even with the medications destroying her cognition, she's still trying to tell the truth. She deserves better than our relief at her silence. Thomas wiped his eyes and stood. Let me pack a bag. I'll drive back with you tonight. As Marcus waited, he looked at the photos of Jessica and thought about how many people Lydia had destroyed, not just killed, but destroyed. Sarah Chen. Jessica. Helen. Thomas. Even David, who'd married a woman whose love was built on lies and calculation. All of them casualties in Lydia's long game of self-preservation. But there was one thing Lydia hadn't counted on, Helen's stubborn refusal to forget completely, and a doctor who'd chosen to believe an old woman everyone else had dismissed as confused. It wasn't much. But it might be enough. Helen's breathing changed at 3:47 in the morning. Marcus had been dozing in the chair beside her bed, his body folded uncomfortably in a position that would leave him aching for days. He'd insisted on staying the night after Thomas arrived, after they'd spent hours strategizing with hospital administration and a sympathetic detective who'd agreed to review the case. They'd been so close to moving Helen to a secure location, so close to getting her away from Lydia's reach. But Lydia had made her move first. The monitor's alarm pierced the silence, its shrill beeping dragging Marcus from half-sleep to full panic. Helen's oxygen levels were dropping, her heart rate erratic. Her chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate gasps that sounded like drowning on dry land. I need help in here. Marcus shouted, hitting the call button repeatedly while moving to Helen's side. Her eyes were open but unfocused, her lips already taking on a bluish tinge that made his stomach drop. Nurses flooded in, bringing with them the controlled chaos of medical emergency, oxygen mask, vitals checks, medication drawn up in syringes that caught the fluorescent light. Marcus stepped back, letting them work, his mind racing through possibilities. Heart attack. Stroke. Reaction to medication. Or something else entirely. Where's her daughter-in-law? He demanded. Where's Lydia? She left around 11, one of the nurses said, not looking up from where she was adjusting Helen's for. Said she needed to go home and rest. Marcus grabbed Helen's chart, flipping through the medication log with hands that shook from adrenaline and fury. There, documented at 10:45 p.m., just 15 minutes before Lydia left. A dose of lorazepam, signed off by the night nurse with Lydia's notation that Helen had been agitated and unable to sleep. Did anyone verify this dosage? Marcus asked, his voice tight. The nurse looked up, confused. Mrs. Moore administered it herself. She has authorization from. She doesn't have authorization anymore, Marcus cut her off. That authorization was revoked this afternoon. Who gave her access to medications? The nurse's face went pale. I didn't know. She seemed so concerned, and Helen was agitated. I thought. Marcus didn't wait to hear the rest. He grabbed the empty vial from the medication tray and held it up to the light. The label read lorazepam, 2 milligrams, standard dosage. But the liquid inside had been clear, and lorazepam solution had a slightly different consistency. He'd seen enough medications tampered with over the past weeks to recognize the signs. Send this to the lab immediately, he ordered. I want a full analysis. And someone call security, I want Lydia Moore detained if she tries to enter this hospital. Helen made a sound then, a wet, rattling noise that pulled Marcus's attention back to her. Despite the oxygen mask, despite the nurses working frantically around her, she was trying to speak. Her hand reached out, trembling violently, fingers grasping at air. Marcus took her hand, leaning close enough to hear the whisper beneath the mask. Lydia. Helen managed, the word barely formed. Tell her. I forgive. Don't, Marcus said, his voice breaking despite his best efforts to remain clinical. Don't waste your strength on forgiveness. We're going to fix this. We're going to make sure she can't hurt anyone else. But Helen was shaking her head, tears streaming from the corners of her eyes. She's broken, not evil, just so afraid. The heart monitor's beeping became more irregular. The nurse called out numbers that Marcus knew meant they were losing her. He watched, helpless, as the woman who tried for 15 years to be heard, who'd fought through manufactured confusion to tell the truth, began to slip away. Helen, stay with me, he pleaded. Thomas is here. Your son is here. He drove all the way from Georgia because he believes you now. He knows you were right about everything. Something flickered in Helen's eyes, hope, maybe, or just the last spark of consciousness before it guttered out. Her grip on Marcus's hand tightened with surprising strength. Tell Thomas. She gasped. Not his fault. I chose silence too, that night. I heard them, could have, stopped it, but I was scared. The admission hit Marcus like a physical blow. Helen wasn't just a witness, she'd been a participant in the cover-up, choosing her own safety over speaking out immediately about what she'd heard. The guilt had been eating at her for 15 years, as corrosive as any poison Lydia had given her. Helen. The truth doesn't need revenge. Helen's voice was fading, each word requiring effort that was visibly destroying her. Just needs to not be forgotten. The door burst open and Thomas rushed in, his face gray with fear. He'd been in the cafeteria, trying to eat something Marcus had insisted on, trying to keep his strength up for the battles ahead. Now he pushed past the nurses to reach his mother's other side. Mom, he choked out. Mom, I'm so sorry. I should have believed you. I should have. Helen's eyes found her son's face, and for a moment the fog cleared completely. Marcus saw recognition there, and love, and forgiveness for sins Thomas hadn't even finished confessing. My boy. She whispered. So much, like your father, too kind, to see evil. I see it now, Thomas said, tears streaming down his face. I see all of it now, and I'm going to make sure she pays for what she did to Jessica. To you. To all of us. Helen's expression changed then, becoming urgent despite her failing body. She pulled both Marcus and Thomas closer, using the last of her strength to make them understand something crucial. She killed Sarah, in Atlanta, Helen managed, the words coming faster now as if she knew time was running out. But Jessica was accident. Lydia didn't mean to push so hard, they were arguing, at top of stairs. Jessica said, would expose everything. Lydia grabbed her, just to stop her talking. Jessica pulled away, and fell. Marcus and Thomas exchanged glances. This changed everything. If Jessica's death had been manslaughter rather than premeditated murder, if Lydia had spent 15 years running from an accident rather than a calculated killing. She's been destroying me, because she can't destroy her guilt, Helen continued, her voice barely audible now. She sees Sarah, in every shadow, sees Jessica, at bottom of stairs, every time, she closes her eyes. The poison, she gives me, she wishes, someone had given her, 15 years ago. It was the saddest truth Marcus had ever heard, that Lydia's cruelty came not from evil but from a desperate, failing attempt to outrun consequences that had already caught her, to silence witnesses to crimes that were already written in her own consciousness. Helen's breathing became more labored. The monitors screamed warnings that everyone in the room already understood. They were losing her, and there was nothing more the medicine could do. Mom, Thomas sobbed. Please don't go. Please. I need to make this right. Helen smiled then, actually smiled, her face transformed by something that looked almost like peace. "You will," she whispered. "But not with hatred. With truth. The truth, about Lydia's fear, about my silence, about how we all chose the easier path, until the paths led here." Her hand in Marcus's went limp. The monitor's alarm changed pitch, becoming a single, sustained note that marked the end of everything Helen Moore had tried so hard to say. The nurses moved in with practiced efficiency, checking for responses they knew wouldn't come, going through protocols that were more ritual than hope. Marcus stepped back, his hand still warm from Helen's touch, his mind full of her final words. Thomas collapsed into the chair, his body racked with sobs that sounded like they were being torn from somewhere deep inside him. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that would make this moment anything other than what it was, the death of a woman who'd spent 15 years being called confused, and her final gift being the most painful clarity anyone could offer. Lydia hadn't just stolen Helen's memories. She'd stolen 15 years of a family believing their matriarch, 15 years of justice for Jessica, 15 years of Sarah Chen's death being recognized as something other than an accident. But she hadn't stolen the truth itself. That had survived, carried in Helen's determination, recorded in hospital documents, witnessed by the people in this room who would make sure that Helen Moore's last words wouldn't be forgotten. Outside the window, dawn was breaking over the West Virginia mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and red that looked too beautiful for the grief filling this small hospital room. Helen was gone. But her silence had finally, mercifully, ended. Lydia Moore turned herself in 36 hours after Helen died. She walked into the Morgantown Police Department at 9:15 on a Tuesday morning, wearing a simple black dress as if she'd come from a funeral, which, in a way, she had. Helen's memorial service had been the day before, a small gathering at First Methodist Church where Lydia had sat in the front pew beside David, her face composed in grief that looked so genuine even Marcus, who knew the truth, found himself doubting for a moment. But doubt evaporated when Detective Sarah Chen, no relation to the Atlanta victim, though the coincidence felt like cosmic irony, played the security footage from the hospital the night Helen died. It showed Lydia in the medication room at 10:43 p.m., carefully switching the contents of 2 vials, her movements practiced and efficient. She'd done it right in front of the security camera, as if part of her wanted to be caught. Or as if 15 years of running had finally exhausted her. "I'd like to make a statement," Lydia said when they brought her into the interrogation room. Her voice was calm, almost relieved. "I'd like to tell you everything." Marcus watched through the two-way mirror, standing beside Thomas, who hadn't left Morgantown since his mother's death. David was there too, though he stood apart from his brother, his face a mask of incomprehension and betrayal. He'd learned in the span of 48 hours that his wife was not who he'd believed, that his mother had died trying to expose her, and that he'd spent years dismissing his own family's concerns as confusion and grief. Some truths were too large to process all at once. "My real name is Lydia Hartwell," she began, her hands folded on the table in front of her. "I changed it legally after I left Atlanta in 2007. I was running from what I'd done to my roommate, Sarah Chen." Detective Chen, Sarah Chen, Marcus had to remind himself, leaned forward. "Tell us about Sarah." "She was good," Lydia said simply. "That was the problem. She was good and I was desperate. We'd been roommates for 2 years. She'd just gotten a promotion at work, had started dating someone seriously, was talking about buying a condo and asked if I wanted to go in on it with her. But I couldn't afford it. I was drowning in debt for my mother's medical bills. She died the year before, left me with nothing but bills and this crushing, suffocating pressure to be someone other than the failure I'd become." Her voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were describing someone else's life rather than confessing to actions that had destroyed multiple families. "Sarah had taken out a life insurance policy through her work," Lydia continued. "She mentioned it casually one day, said she'd made me the beneficiary since I was her closest friend and she didn't have much family. It was supposed to be this touching gesture of trust. And all I could think was, $40,000. Enough to pay off my debts. Enough to start over. Marcus felt sick listening to the calculation in her voice, the way she'd turned friendship into opportunity. I researched carbon monoxide poisoning for 3 weeks, Lydia said. Learned about the symptoms, the timeline, how to make it look accidental. I bought a space heater with a known defect, waited until Sarah would be alone for the weekend, and installed it in her room. I told her I'd gotten it for her because her room was always cold. She thanked me. Lydia's voice finally broke on that word. She thanked me for the thing I was using to end her life. And then you left town for the weekend, Detective Chen said, consulting her notes. I went to visit a friend in Chattanooga. Perfect alibi. I came back Monday morning and discovered Sarah's body. I was devastated. Everyone believed I was devastated. Lydia looked up, meeting the detective's eyes. The horrible thing is, I was devastated. I'd convinced myself it would be clean, painless, that Sarah wouldn't suffer. But when I saw her, I realized what I'd actually done. Not just taken her life for money, but stolen all the years she should have had. The condo she wanted to buy. The relationship she was building. Everything. But you took the insurance money anyway, Marcus said through the intercom, unable to stay silent. Lydia flinched at his voice but nodded. I took it. Moved to West Virginia. Changed my name. Tried to become someone different. And for a while I thought I'd succeeded. Then I met Thomas Harrington and his family, and for the first time since Sarah died, I felt like maybe I could be good again. Like maybe I could earn redemption by being a good sister-in-law, a good friend to Jessica. Thomas made a sound of disgust beside Marcus, but he didn't look away from the window. Jessica found the documents about Sarah, Detective Chen prompted. She found everything, Lydia said. Every newspaper clipping I'd kept, I don't know why I kept them, maybe some part of me wanted to be caught, every receipt, every note. She confronted me the night she died. She said she was going to turn me in, that I needed to confess before she went to the police herself. She gave me 24 hours to do the right thing. Lydia's hands were shaking now, her composure finally cracking. We were standing at the top of the basement stairs, arguing. She kept saying, you have to face what you've done, you have to stop running. And I reached for her. Not to push, I swear I didn't mean to push. I just wanted to make her stop talking, to make her understand that I couldn't face it, that confessing would destroy everything I'd built. But she pulled away from me, and her foot slipped on the top step, and then she was falling. The room was silent except for Lydia's ragged breathing. I could have called 911 immediately, she said. Could have told the truth about how it happened. But I panicked. I left through the back door, drove around for an hour trying to decide what to do, then came back and discovered her body. Made it look like I'd just arrived. And it worked. Everyone believed me. Except Helen. Helen heard you arrive the first time, Detective Chen said. Helen heard everything, Lydia confirmed. She tried to tell the police, but I'd been so careful with my timeline, so composed in my statements. They believed me over her. And I told myself that was enough. That I could live with Jessica's death being ruled an accident, that I could move on and be better. But Helen didn't forget, Marcus said. No. Lydia's voice was barely audible now. She never forgot. And when I started dating David 2 years later, I could see it in her eyes every time she looked at me. She knew. She couldn't prove it, but she knew. And I realized I'd never be free as long as she could remember that night. The confession that followed was detailed and devastating. How Lydia had researched medications that caused cognitive decline. How she'd gradually replaced Helen's prescriptions with variations that would increase confusion while looking like normal dementia progression. How she'd built her reputation as a devoted caregiver specifically to ensure that when Helen tried to tell people what she remembered, no one would believe a confused old woman over the saint who cared for her. I thought if I could just erase her memories of that night, I could finally stop seeing Jessica at the bottom of those stairs every time I closed my eyes," Lydia said, tears streaming down her face now. But it didn't work. Nothing worked. Because the person I was really trying to erase wasn't Helen, it was myself. The version of me that had valued $40,000 over Sarah's life. The version that had let Jessica fall and then lied about it. The version that had spent 15 years destroying an innocent woman's mind to protect secrets that were already destroying me from the inside. David was crying now, silent tears that Marcus pretended not to notice. Thomas stood rigid, his face carved from stone. Helen's last words, Marcus said through the intercom, were about forgiveness. "She said to tell you that you're not evil, just afraid. That the truth doesn't need revenge, only to be remembered." Lydia's composure shattered completely. She put her face in her hands and sobbed, great, racking sobs that sounded like something breaking that had been held together too long by willpower alone. When she could speak again, her voice was raw. "I don't deserve forgiveness. Not from Helen, not from Sarah's family, not from Jessica's memory. But I can give them the truth. All of it. For whatever that's worth after everything I've taken from them." The legal process that followed was complicated and painful. Lydia was charged with manslaughter in Jessica's death, fraud in Sarah's insurance claim, and multiple counts of elder abuse for what she'd done to Helen. The prosecutors offered a plea deal, 20 years in exchange for full cooperation and testimony that would close both the Atlanta and Morgantown cases definitively. Lydia accepted without negotiation. At the sentencing hearing, she read a statement that Marcus would remember for the rest of his life. She talked about the weight of living with guilt, about how she'd thought she was protecting herself when really she'd been building a prison more confining than any cell she'd end up in. She talked about Helen's courage, about how a confused old woman had been braver than she'd ever been, fighting to tell the truth even as the truth was being stolen from her piece by piece. "I can't give back the years I stole," Lydia said, her voice steady despite the tears on her face. "I can't bring Sarah or Jessica or Helen back. But I can stop lying. I can stop making other people pay for my cowardice. And maybe someday, that will mean something." Marcus attended the hearing along with Thomas and David. The brothers sat on opposite sides of the courtroom, their relationship fractured by revelations neither of them had asked for. But as they left, Marcus saw them stop in the parking lot, saw Thomas reach for his brother, saw David collapse against him in grief that needed no words. Some fractures could heal, given time and truth. 3 months later, Marcus received a package in the mail. Inside was a cassette tape in a plastic case, labeled in Helen's shaky handwriting, "For whoever finally listens." He drove to Thomas's house. He'd moved back to West Virginia, taking a job at a veteran center, trying to rebuild the life he'd run from. They listened to the tape together, Helen's voice filling the room with words she'd recorded years ago, when her memory was still intact but her hope of being believed was already fading. "The truth doesn't ask for revenge," Helen's voice said on the recording. "It just asks to not be forgotten. So I'm telling it now, while I still can, in case someday someone is brave enough to listen. In case someday the silence ends and the truth can finally rest." Thomas cried listening to his mother's voice. Marcus put a hand on his shoulder and said nothing, because some moments needed silence more than comfort. Outside, spring was coming to West Virginia, the mountains turning green with new life that didn't care about human tragedy or human triumph, that just kept growing regardless. Helen was gone. Jessica was gone. Sarah was gone. But their truth remained, spoken at last, heard at last, remembered at last. And maybe, in the end, that was the only justice that mattered. Helen Moore spent 15 years trying to be heard, fighting against a fog that was deliberately created to silence her. She carried the weight of a truth so heavy it eventually consumed her, yet she never stopped trying to speak it. Her story forces us to confront uncomfortable questions. How many times have we dismissed someone's truth because it was inconvenient to believe them? How often do we choose the comfort of denial over the difficulty of facing what we know, deep down, is real? And perhaps most painfully, if you were Thomas, Could you have found the courage to believe your mother when doing so meant admitting you'd brought danger into your own family? This story isn't really about Lydia's crimes or even about the justice that finally came. It's about the cost of silence, the silence of those who know but choose not to speak, the silence forced upon those trying desperately to be heard, and the silence that eats away at us when we run from our own guilt instead of facing it. Helen's final words remind us that truth doesn't demand revenge, it only asks not to be forgotten. In our own lives, when we encounter someone struggling to be believed, when we hear whispers of something wrong beneath a surface that looks perfect, will we have the courage to listen? Will we be like Marcus, who chose to believe when everyone else found it easier not to? Or will we be like Thomas in those lost years, running from truths too painful to face until it's almost too late? If this story moved you, if it made you think about the truths you've spoken or the truths you've chosen not to hear, please follow this channel for more stories that challenge and inspire. Leave a like, share this with someone who needs to hear it, and let us know in the comments what you would have done in Helen's place, in Marcus's place, or even in Lydia's. Because these aren't just characters in a story, they're reflections of choices we all face when silence seems safer than truth.